Why do you feel like you're sprinting every single day and still ending the month with nothing left in the account? Not once in a while. Every month. You worked the extra shift. You skipped the vacation. You answered emails at 11 at night. And somehow, the bank balance looks the same as it did a year ago, except your patience is thinner and your sleep is worse. If busy and broke keep showing up together in your life, that is not a coincidence. And it is not a personal failing. It is a mechanism. And once you see the mechanism, you can actually do something about it. The paradox of hustle. Here is the strange part nobody warns you about. We are taught that busy and broke are opposite problems with opposite solutions. If you are broke, work more hours. If you are too busy, that at least means you are doing well financially, right? Except that is not how it plays out for millions of people in their 20s and 30s. They are working more than ever, taking side gigs, saying yes to every extra shift, and they are still living paycheck to paycheck, still one car repair away from a credit card spiral. The reason this looks paradoxical is that we treat time and money as two separate columns in life's spreadsheet. Fix the money column, the time column takes care of itself. Fix the time column, hope the money follows. But there is a growing body of behavioral science that says these are not two columns. They are the same column, wearing two different labels. Scarcity of time and scarcity of money produce the exact same psychological fingerprint in the brain. Same tunnel vision. Same short-term thinking. Same expensive mistakes. Once you understand that, just work harder. Stop sounding like a solution and start sounding like pouring gasoline on the exact fire you are trying to put out. That is the claim this episode is going to unpack, piece by piece, not as a motivational slogan, but as a mechanism backed by research that explains why you can be doing everything right and still feel stuck. And once we see the mechanism clearly, we will get to what actually breaks it. Let's start at the root. Not what scarcity does to your bank account or your calendar, what it does to your brain. What scarcity does to the brain. In 2013, economist Sendil Mullainathan and psychologist Eldar Shafir published a book called Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Their core finding was uncomfortable in the best way, because it took the blame off individual willpower and put it somewhere much more useful. They found that scarcity of any resource, whether it is time, money, food, or even social contact, behaves like a magnet for attention. When something is scarce, your mind locks onto that shortfall the way a hungry person's mind locks onto food. Every hallway smells like a bakery. Every thought bends back toward the thing you don't have enough of. They called this tunneling. Your focus narrows to the immediate gap. And that narrowing is not a character flaw. It is a cognitive feature that evolved for good reason. If you are actually starving, obsessing over your next meal is smart. But in modern life, that same tunneling gets triggered by rent due in 5 days or a project deadline crammed into a week you don't have. And here's the catch. Tunneling has a cost. It buys you laser focus on the urgent thing directly in front of you, at the price of everything just outside the tunnel. Long-term planning, preventive maintenance, the quiet, unsexy stuff that keeps a life from sliding into crisis. That stuff gets starved of attention because attention is the resource scarcity is quietly stealing from you. So if you have ever wondered why you can be smart, capable, hardworking, and still make decisions that seem obviously bad in hindsight, this is the first clue. It was never really about intelligence or discipline. It was about how much mental room you had left to think clearly. Which brings us to a study that put an actual number on that mental room. The bandwidth tax, measured theory, is one thing. A measured effect is another. In 2013, a team led by Anandi Mani, along with Mullainathan Shafir and Zhao, published a study in the journal Science called Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function. They went to sugarcane farmers in India, People who get paid once at harvest and then live off that lump sum until the next one. That means the exact same person is cash poor right before harvest and comparatively cash flush right after it. Same person, same intelligence, same skills. Only the financial scarcity changes. The researchers gave these farmers cognitive tests, the kind that measure fluid intelligence and impulse control at both points. Before the harvest, when money was tight, performance dropped, not a little. The decline was comparable to losing an entire night of sleep, or roughly 13 to 14 IQ points. Let that sit for a second. 13 to 14 points is the difference between an average score and a score that would raise real concern in a clinical setting. And it wasn't a permanent trait. It came back after harvest, when the same brain had breathing room again. This is the part that matters most for anyone blaming themselves for bad decisions during a hard financial stretch. The farmers were not less capable people before harvest. Their raw intelligence hadn't changed. What changed was how much of that intelligence was actually available for use, because a chunk of it was locked up running background calculations about money, rent, bills. What can wait? What can't? That background process runs constantly, silently, and it eats exactly the kind of mental bandwidth you need for good long-term decisions. Translate that to a time-poor version. Chronic time pressure runs the same background process. Instead of can I afford this, it's when can I possibly fit this in? Same tax, same drain, different currency. So now we have two separate mechanisms, doing the same thing to the same brain, which naturally leads to the response almost everyone tries first: work more. Hustle culture makes the tax worse, not better. If bandwidth is the scarce resource, then the instinctive fix, work more hours, get a side hustle, grind harder, is treating the symptom by making the disease worse. Working more hours under time pressure does not create more bandwidth. It consumes the bandwidth you have left even faster, because now you are tunneling on time scarcity on top of whatever money scarcity already had you tunneling on. Here's where it becomes visible in real numbers, not just feelings. Someone stretched thin on time is statistically more likely to pay a late fee, because reading the fine print or setting a reminder requires exactly the kind of spare attention that's already gone. They are more likely to make an impulse purchase, because impulse control is one of the first things to erode under cognitive load, proven directly in that farmer study. They are more likely to reach for a short-term, high-interest loan to cover a gap, because evaluating a loan's true cost takes bandwidth they simply don't have. In that moment, they just need the immediate problem to go away. None of that is stupidity. It is bandwidth-starved decision-making, functioning exactly the way scarcity research predicts it will. But hustle culture sells the opposite story. It says the answer to feeling behind is always more hours, more hustle, more grind, and it frames anyone who says, I need to protect my time and attention, as lazy or making excuses. That messaging is not just wrong, it is actively working against the mechanism we just described, because it pushes people to hollow out the exact resource, bandwidth, that would let them make the smarter, structural decision instead of the desperate one. So if working more isn't the lever, what is? To answer that, we need to look at how people already misjudge the trade between time and money, even when they have a choice. The time-money trade-off people get wrong. In 2017, Harvard Business School researcher Ashley Willens and her colleagues published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called Buying Time Promotes Happiness. Their finding, across thousands of people and multiple countries, was that people who prioritize time over money, who would rather have an extra hour than an extra chunk of cash, consistently report higher life satisfaction than people who prioritize money over time. Here's the twist, and it's an important one. Despite that, most people keep choosing money over time anyway, and the tendency gets stronger, not weaker, as income rises. You would think once someone has enough money to comfortably buy back some hours, they'd start doing it. Instead, a lot of people just recalibrate what enough means and keep optimizing for more income, more hours worked, more side income streams, even when the data says the extra hour would have made them happier than the extra dollars. Why does this happen? Partly, it's because money is easy to measure and time is not. A raise has a number attached to it. An hour of freedom does not come with a receipt, so it feels less real as a thing worth trading for, even though the well-being research says it matters more. And partly, this loops right back to the scarcity mechanism. When you're tunneling on money, the option that visibly adds money always wins the mental contest, because that's what the tunnel is pointed at. The option that would give you back an hour barely registers, because attention has already been captured by the shortfall. This matters because it sets up the next trap, one that looks like the smart move, the Willans approved move, buying back your time, but that can secretly be doing the opposite of what it claims. The convenience trap. Delivery apps. Subscription services. One-click shortcuts for everything from groceries to laundry. On the surface, this looks exactly like what Ashley Willen's research recommends, trading a bit of money to buy back time. And sometimes it genuinely is that. Sometimes paying for delivery on a night you're truly underwater is the right call, full stop. But here's the trap. Convenience spending only buys back time in the way the research intends when it is solving a temporary situational crunch. It becomes something very different when it's quietly patching a structural problem instead of fixing it. If you're ordering delivery every night not because tonight is unusually brutal, but because your schedule never has room to cook, meal prep, or even think about food until you're starving and exhausted, that's not buying time. That's paying money to avoid confronting the fact that your schedule itself is broken. And this is where the two scarcities start feeding each other directly. The convenience spending drains the exact cash reserve that would have given you breathing room, more slack on the money side, which increases money scarcity, which increases tunneling on money, which makes it even harder to step back and ask the bigger question: why is my schedule built in a way that requires me to buy my way out of it every single day? The convenience purchase feels like relief in the moment, and it is, briefly, but it can be bleeding the very resource that would let you shrink the loop instead of just numbing it. The test isn't, did this cost money? The test is, does this convenience purchase address a one-off spike, or is it standing in for a structural fix I'm avoiding? That distinction alone will save most people real money over a year. But convenience spending is a mild version of a much harsher loop, one involving debt, the debt and overtime feedback loop. This is where the mechanism turns genuinely dangerous, because it becomes self-reinforcing in a way that's hard to see from inside it. Start with high-interest debt, a credit card balance, a short-term loan taken out during a bandwidth-starved moment, exactly like the one we described 2 chapters ago. That debt now requires monthly payments. To make those payments, a lot of people pick up extra hours, an extra shift, a side gig, anything to service the debt. But we already established what extra hours under time pressure does to bandwidth. It doesn't add slack, it removes it. So now this person is running an even heavier bandwidth tax than before. Exactly the condition that produces the late fees, the impulse buys, the next bad loan, which adds more debt, which demands more overtime to service it, which taxes bandwidth further, round and round. From the outside, and often from the inside too, this looks like a discipline problem. I just need to budget better. I just need more willpower to stop overspending. But look at the shape of it again. It is a structural loop, powered by a well-documented cognitive mechanism, not a character flaw. Blaming willpower for a structural bandwidth problem is like blaming a phone battery for dying faster when you're running 15 power-hungry apps at once. The battery isn't broken. The demand on it is too high. This is precisely why interventions aimed at try harder or be more disciplined tend to fail for people caught in this loop. They're aiming at the wrong layer of the problem. The real lever sits one level down, in the amount of slack available in the system before a shock even hits, which is exactly what we turn to next. Escaping tunnel vision, the slack concept. Mullainathan and Shafir didn't just diagnose the scarcity trap, they proposed an antidote, and it's simpler than most self-help advice, though not easier to actually do. They call it slack. Slack is deliberately built-in buffer, extra time or extra cash that exists before you need it, specifically so that one unexpected event doesn't cascade into a full-blown crisis demanding emergency bandwidth you don't have. Think about the difference between a calendar with 0 gaps and a calendar with a couple of unscheduled hours built into every week. In the 0-gap calendar, one delayed meeting, one sick kid, one flat tire, and the whole week collapses because there was never any room to absorb a shock. In the version with slack, that same disruption gets absorbed by the buffer. No tunneling required because there's nothing urgent enough to tunnel on. Money slack works identically. A small emergency fund isn't just good practice in some vague financial advice column sense. It is a direct structural defense against the exact mechanism we've spent this episode describing. When the car needs a $200 repair and there's a buffer for it, that event stays a minor inconvenience. When there's no buffer, that same $200 repair can trigger the entire debt and overtime loop we just walked through. High-interest borrowing, extra shifts, a fresh bandwidth tax, more mistakes. The key insight is timing. Slack has to be built before the crunch, not improvised during it, because during the crunch is exactly when your bandwidth is most compromised and least capable of engineering a good solution. This is a preventive structure, not a reactive fix, which raises a very practical question. How do you actually know when spending money to save time is building useful slack versus when it's just convenience trap spending in disguise? That's worth a real exercise, not just a rule of thumb. A practical time value audit. Here's a concrete way to draw that line for yourself. Most people, when they estimate what their time is worth, take their annual salary and divide it by 2080, the standard work year hours. That number is almost always wrong because it ignores everything time actually costs you outside of work and everything a purchased hour actually gives back. Try this instead. Take your take-home pay. Subtract the hours you're already obligated to spend. Working, commuting, and recovering from work, sleep, unwind time, anything you'd consider non-negotiable. What's left is your genuinely discretionary time each week. Divide your monthly disposable income, not gross salary, disposable income, by that number of discretionary hours. That gives you a rough, real hourly value specific to your actual life, not a textbook formula. Now use that number as a filter. If a convenience purchase, delivery, a cleaning service, paying for faster shipping, costs less than your real hourly value, and it buys back time you'd otherwise spend on low-value, replaceable tasks, that's a good trade. Buy the time back without guilt. But if it costs more than your real hourly value, or if the time it buys back just gets absorbed into more scrolling or more low-value activity, rather than something that reduces your scarcity loop, rest, planning, or actual slack building, then it's convenience trap spending wearing a disguise. This audit takes maybe 20 minutes to do once, and it turns a vague guilt-based question, should I really be paying for this, into a specific, personal, defensible number. That alone removes a small but real chunk of the bandwidth tax, because you stop relitigating the same decision from scratch every single week. Systems beat willpower under scarcity. Here's the part that ties directly back to the core mechanism. Bandwidth is exactly what scarcity depletes. So any solution that demands more bandwidth, more willpower, more in-the-moment discipline is asking for the one resource that's already running on empty. That's why So many New Year's resolution-style fixes fail specifically for people in a scarcity spiral. Not because they're weak, but because the fix itself requires the very thing the spiral has stripped away. The actual lever is removing decisions from the taxed brain entirely, rather than asking it to make more good ones. Automate the transfer to savings the day the paycheck lands, before there's a chance to tunnel on an immediate want. Put bills on autopay, so a late fee, one of the classic scarcity-driven mistakes, becomes structurally impossible rather than a discipline test you have to pass every single month. Build a default weekly meal plan, even a boring, repetitive one, so what's for dinner stops being a nightly decision made at the exact moment your bandwidth is lowest, right after a long day. None of these are exciting. They're not going to make anyone feel like they've had a big transformative breakthrough in the moment. But that's exactly the point. Slack and systems work quietly, in the background, precisely so your limited bandwidth doesn't have to be spent guarding against the small failures scarcity makes likely. You're not becoming more disciplined. You're re-engineering the system so discipline is needed less often. To see how all of this actually plays out together, let's walk through a composite picture of someone living this loop and getting out of it. Composite case walkthrough. This next scenario is a composite, a hypothetical built to illustrate the mechanism clearly, not a real individual. Picture someone in their late 20s. We'll call them Jordan for the sake of the story. Working a full-time job and picking up freelance work most evenings to cover a credit card balance from an old emergency. Jordan is tunneling hard, on money because the balance keeps them anxious, and on time because every evening is already spoken for before it starts. A small car repair comes up, $240. No buffer exists, so it goes on the credit card, adding to the balance that's already driving the extra freelance hours. Those extra hours cut further into sleep and planning time. A week later, distracted and running on fumes, Jordan misses a bill due date and eats a late fee. Exactly the kind of mistake the sugarcane farmer study would predict from someone operating under a heavy bandwidth tax, not from carelessness. Now picture the intervention. Jordan does the time value audit from 2 chapters ago and realizes the freelance hours, once you account for the toll on sleep and decision quality, are worth less than they appear on paper. Jordan redirects some of that freelance income, just a modest amount each month, into a small emergency buffer instead of extra spending, and sets up autopay on every recurring bill, so a distracted week can't produce another late fee. 6 months in, the buffer is large enough that the next surprise expense, a phone repair, doesn't trigger a new debt cycle at all. It just gets paid from the buffer. No tunneling, no crisis, no extra shift required. Nothing about Jordan's income changed dramatically in this story. What changed was the amount of slack in the system, and that changed how every subsequent shock got absorbed. That's the mechanism in miniature. And it's the same one available to anyone listening right now. Close, redefine wealth as bandwidth. So let's pull the whole thing together. Time poverty and money poverty aren't 2 separate battles you're losing on 2 separate fronts. They're the same trap. Scarcity capturing your attention, narrowing your focus to the immediate shortfall, and taxing exactly the mental bandwidth you'd need to make the long-term decision that actually fixes things. Hustle harder, and you often feed that same tax instead of relieving it. Spend to buy back time without checking whether you're patching a symptom or a root cause, and you can quietly drain the resource meant to shrink the loop. The way out isn't more grit. It's more slack, built deliberately, before you need it, and systems that make good decisions automatic instead of demanding them from a brain that's already stretched thin. Which means real wealth was never just the number in your bank account, and it was never just having empty hours on a calendar either. Real wealth is the mental bandwidth left over after your obligations are met, the space in your head that isn't being eaten by tunnel vision on what's missing. That's the thing worth building toward. So here's a 3-step start this week, not someday. First, pick one bill or one savings transfer and automate it today, removing one decision permanently from your future self. Second, run the real-time value audit on just one recurring expense and decide honestly whether it's slack or a trap. Third, if you can, redirect even a small, unglamorous amount toward an emergency buffer this week, not because it will fix everything overnight, but because it's the first brick of slack between you and the next unexpected hit. Start there and let the loop start working for you instead of against you.